afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me at today's conference. I'm going to present some research that we did for the agency last year. As Peter mentioned, there's a range of activities going on. So we've got to keep in mind that this is sort of data that was collected May 2014. It's provided us with some benchmark measures or baseline measures about where awareness, attitudes and behaviours in relation to asbestos sat at that point in time. And ideally, as we move forward and the agency implements its range of activities, we'll see some of these benchmark measures move in the right direction. So in terms of what we did, basically, we wanted quantitative research to provide a snapshot of where awareness, attitudes and behaviours sat in relation to asbestos. There were some primary and secondary audiences identified. Tradespeople and DIY home renovators were the two sort of audiences that the agency really felt at the most pointy end. Obviously, the highest risk of exposure through their activities, and therefore was a real strong need to identify where those guys mapped in terms of awareness, attitudes and behaviours. Secondary audiences, real estate agents and landlords, those that can provide a key influence point in terms of people purchasing property, moving into new properties, etc., being more aware of risks they may be potentially exposed to given the asbestos risk rating of that property. And then the general public, what do the general public feel about asbestos? What do they know about it? What do they need to know about it? Someone not involved in home renovation or in a tradesperson role might think, I don't need to know anything about asbestos. Well, we all know that we're potentially one house purchase away from actually having a situation where we may be having to deal with asbestos, and it's important therefore that knowledge of this issue is at a level whereby people can engage, understand that this is a real risk and what they can do about that. So what we found. So I'm going to take you through, basically the main structure of the survey was a battery of attitudinal and behavioural questions, generally on a 5-point scale. So these slides that I'll present are all sort of formatted in the same way. We've got the findings for the general public at the left-hand side, tradespeople second from the left, we've got the DIY home renovators second from the right, and the far right, real estate agents and landlords. I'll make the point that both the general public and the tradespeople audiences and the home renovators for that matter were nationally representative samples. So general public and home renovators were done via an online survey format. Tradespeople, we actually did a telephone survey on a national basis, and tradespeople were screened to be working in a sector related to building and construction. So obviously they needed that point of reference. So in terms of how important is it to know about asbestos and its related dangers, a positive result here in terms of most people considering important, tradespeople 82% rating it a very important issue to be aware of. So we then said, okay, importance, how informed do you feel on asbestos related dangers? As you can see, we see some dips here with the red in terms of people feeling either poorly informed or not informed, especially in relation to the general public. Still quite a good result in terms of tradespeople, albeit that 12% are only moderately informed on this issue. Some 20% of the general public describe themselves as either poorly or not at all informed. We ask on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is no knowledge at all and 5 is very knowledgeable, how do they self-rate their knowledge of asbestos and its related dangers? Similar pattern emerging here with tradespeople obviously far more engaged on this issue, rating their knowledge higher, albeit that there's still close to 20% who are only giving themselves that moderate rating or lower. So even though as a group across these 4 different groups they're emerging as obviously more engaged, more knowledgeable, there's still a real issue here in terms of ensuring that the people that are more likely to be exposed to asbestos in the workplace are really mindful of those risks and taking appropriate strategies to mitigate that risk. Confidence and ability to identify asbestos-containing materials. So a scale of 1 to 5, 1 not at all confident, 5 very confident. Obviously, general public, far less knowledgeable about what stuff, where is this stuff in my house? We're seeing a big drop here in terms of the confidence in being able to know where asbestos might be in their house. Similar pattern with DIY home renovators and real estate agents and landlords. Tradespeople, a better result, but again, more than 1 in 10 not confident in this regard, and these are tradespeople. So again, this sort of reiterates to us that the job's far from complete in terms of educating this cohort about the dangers and the risks that might be open to them in the workforce. Confidence in ability to identify situations with risk of asbestos exposure. Again, 28% of tradespeople only moderately confident or below, and it drops right away for other audiences, general public, home renovators, and real estate agents and landlords. So that sort of, oh look, I know that asbestos is a problem, it's an issue. I've heard that it causes cancer and is not something you want to sort of mess with. There's a gap between that sort of more positive sort of understanding or at least recognition of the risk versus the practical, okay, where is this stuff? How do I potentially ensure that I don't get exposed to asbestos? Okay, we then asked a series of attitudinal questions about dealing with asbestos. First one was anyone doing renovations needs to be very mindful of asbestos. A great result here in terms of almost universal agreement across these 4 groups that we surveyed. I would pay for specialist advice if I was unsure something contained asbestos. What we're seeing here, 17% of tradespeople disagreeing with this statement. Is that because they've had the formal training? Are they aware of the risks and taking appropriate strategies? Is it a cost driver, as the point that you made in terms of, well, I think I can manage this on my own, etc. So, what are the factors underpinning that result? In our interpretation, there's a risk that at least a proportion of that 17% are potentially sort of having greater risk of exposure to asbestos than probably is warranted. Even a small exposure to asbestos can be very dangerous. 10% again of tradespeople disagreeing, including 6% strongly disagreeing. So for us, while as a group there's strong agreement, there is still a significant minority who we feel these results are showing are still possibly a bit too complacent in terms of their attitudes towards asbestos, and how does that translate into actual behaviours on the work site? Asbestos is very common in Australian buildings. As you can see from the dark green below, our tradespeople cohort far more knowledgeable that this stuff is everywhere. It's very prevalent. 10% of the general public saying, I just don't know. 22% neutral. The key result for this slide to us is that, for the general public, it's again that effort to reinsure, to raise awareness that asbestos is very prevalent in the Australian built context. Asbestos only poses a danger if disturbed. 56% strongly agreeing in the tradespeople cohort. So again, more knowledgeable about asbestos and its various states and how those states translate into risks. But again, if you look at the general public, we've got close to 30% disagreeing with that statement. 10% of those just saying, I just don't know. I don't know enough about the topic. I wouldn't have a clue what type of materials contain asbestos. We put these kinds of reverse questions in to ensure that sort of we're drawing the nuances out. As you look at the second column, tradespeople, 44% strongly disagreeing, 16% disagreeing, but of concern, 1 in 5 tradespeople are actually agreeing with this statement. So they're self-assessing, look, to be honest, I don't have a clue where this is. Again, it's reiterating that there's further educational work that needs to be done with those that might be at greatest risk of exposure. So they were a battery of questions that we administered to everyone. We then had a section for tradespeople specifically. So I'm going to quickly go through those results. We asked if they'd had any formal training in relation to asbestos and how it needs to be managed in any building, renovation or demolition work. Only 2 in 5 reported having undertaken formal training in relation to asbestos. So, 60% of people sort of saying, I have had no formal training, I work in the building construction area, yet haven't had any formal training on this issue. For those that had undertaken the training, we asked the question, how useful was the training for you on a 1 to 5 scale? The vast majority of people said it was either very useful or quite useful. Only a small minority saying it was not useful, that training. We then asked a question of everyone whether they'd had training or not, and 29% of all tradespeople we surveyed said that they wanted more training on this issue. So there is demand out there amongst this cohort for more training in relation to asbestos management. We asked tradespeople a series of questions about their attitudes towards risk. Generally, this is quite a positive picture. So all staff in this business are discouraged from taking any risks in relation to asbestos, 87% strong agreement. Our business organisation takes asbestos dangers very seriously. Again, 81% strong agreement. Very little disagreement to these statements. I'm happy to raise the costs of asbestos removal with clients if necessary. If we go to the last one, I know what to do if asbestos is identified on a building renovation or demolition site. You'll see the dark green dropping here. We're starting to see more sort of neutral responses to this one as well. So it's this gap between sort of a positive attitudinal stance and the how that sort of translates into the actual practical application of knowledge of asbestos. This is reiterated in the second slide. So I know how to protect myself from exposure to asbestos. Slightly lower agreement again. I have enough information about asbestos to make informed decisions on the job site. We're starting to see more red, more yellow in terms of neutral ratings for these questions. The standout for us are the last two columns. So I'm concerned about potentially being exposed to asbestos. We're getting 23% saying I don't really have any concerns. I disagree with that statement. Is that because they're knowledgeable, they've had some formal training? Is it because it's not an issue that I'm overly engaged with? And perhaps the final one on the far right, I've had sufficient training about how to identify and manage asbestos on the job site. We've got 25% either strongly disagreeing or disagreeing with that statement. So again, it's adding further weight to this argument that amongst our tradespeople cohort, this is an issue where further training is obviously warranted. Those employing staff were asked whether they understand their legal obligations in terms of ensuring that their staff are not exposed to asbestos at work. And of some concern, 24% didn't feel they had sufficient understanding of those obligations. So, from a legal perspective, again, what are we doing to ensure that those that are managing staff, sending them out on site, are appropriately taking steps to ensure they've got the knowledge, the training, the skills to deal with asbestos appropriately. Looking at DIY home renovators, so these were people that we screened in having had performed some kind of DIY home renovation work in the past 2 years. We asked whether there'd been any sort of risk assessment undertaken for asbestos. Less than half reported that any sort of risk assessment process had taken place prior to those activities being commenced. We asked where asbestos was present, which describes how the asbestos was removed and disposed of. So around 18% of people said asbestos was an issue in the renovation I did. So of those, we said, how did you manage that? Slide on the column on the right-hand side. So the green, a licensed asbestos removalist was hired to do this at 23%. I did this myself, 36%. So over a third of people saying I just managed that process myself. Again, did they have the training? Did they have the right protective equipment? We can't tell from these results, unfortunately, but to us, at a headline level, this is giving us, some concerns around sort of there'd be at least a proportion of these people potentially not taking those appropriate risk mitigation practices. 41% the tradesperson or building contractor did this on my behalf. Similar pattern here to the tradespeople in terms of asbestos removal must be undertaken by a licensed specialist, strong agreement. I take asbestos and its dangers very seriously, again, high agreement. When preparing for any renovation project, asbestos is a key consideration. We're starting to see a dip there in terms of either neutral or some red slipping in. I'm concerned about potentially being exposed to asbestos. We've got 17% disagreeing with that statement. So again, it may be that they're undertaking renovation work where asbestos isn't an issue, but for us, again, it's an interesting benchmark figure to have in terms of at least a proportion of people feeling that this is not an issue of great concern to them. I know what to do if asbestos is identified on a building renovation or demolition site. We're starting to see more red and yellow here, so less awareness, less sort of self-assessed capability to deal with the situation where asbestos is present. I know how to protect myself from exposure to asbestos. Again, 22% saying I don't know that. I have enough information about asbestos to make informed decisions when doing any renovation work. Again, 23% red in terms of disagreeing with that statement. I have sufficient knowledge about how to identify and manage asbestos on the job site. We've got 30% of DIY renovators disagreeing that they actually have that knowledge. So, the task of informing this particular cohort, I think, is a very important one. Real estate agents and landlords, both our budget and timing for this project meant that we weren't able to do a national sample. We had 122 responses to this survey. So these findings are broadly indicative as opposed to necessarily representative of this cohort, but they're still quite interesting. So these guys were asked whether they'd fielded any queries about asbestos from clients over the past 12 months. Only a quarter received questions about asbestos over the past 3 years. Of those who had received such queries, just under 2/3 thought they were well or very well placed to answer the questions, while 16% were not well placed to do this. In terms of formal asbestos training for these guys, much lower. Only 19% recalled receiving such training in the past. Who did it was through their own company primarily, or a peak body in the industry, or an external training organisation. In terms of real estate agent and private landlords' attitudes towards risk and importance of asbestos, I have a duty of care to tenants regarding informing them where asbestos is present. Strong agreement. Asbestos removal costs need to be considered when dealing with properties built or renovated between 1940 and 1990. Again, reasonably strong agreement. We're seeing a dip here. I understand my legal obligations in relation to asbestos when dealing with clients or tenants. High proportion of yellow and red coming through. Similarly, I actively consider asbestos and how tenants could potentially be exposed. We're seeing lower agreement with those statements among this group. Again, this lower practical knowledge coming through with this group too. I know what to do if asbestos is identified in a property, lower levels of agreement. I know how tenants can protect themselves from exposure to asbestos, lower agreement again. And I have enough information about asbestos to avoid clients or tenants where necessary. 25% strongly disagreeing with that statement, a further 23% neutral. Quickly looking at information needs. So we asked who needs more information about asbestos. Tradespeople were the highest at 18%, saying yes, I need some further information. But across the board, there were at least a minority of people who said, I want to know more about this. In terms of information that tradespeople wanted, how to identify asbestos or materials containing asbestos was the highest, 43%. General information, general guidelines, 23%. How to handle asbestos, 15%, and safe removal of asbestos, 12%. Where would tradespeople go for information? So Google search still ranks highly. Turning to an asbestos specialist or removal company, a workplace safety authority is a potentially source of advice. General internet, Master Builders Association, etc. So a variety of sources emerging in terms of where these guys might look for information. So in terms of the conclusions, and keep in mind these were made close to a year ago when we tabled our report to the client. In terms of the general public, while most people agree that asbestos, it's important to be aware of it and its related dangers, 25% say they're only moderately informed and a further 20% feel they're poorly informed on the subject. Very few people are confident in their ability to identify what materials contain asbestos or situations that could pose dangers of exposure. So the findings are suggesting there's a gap between a desire to do the right thing and the practical knowledge about how to actually do so. Self-assessed knowledge of asbestos' dangers is moderate at best amongst the general public. Only moderate understanding of how prevalent asbestos is in the Australian built environment. We believe the most prudent approach is to minimise exposure risk and to assume that anyone could engage in risky or dangerous asbestos behaviours into the future. So for us, collectively, there's strong evidence of the need for ongoing communication with the broader community on this important topic. For tradespeople, they're generally more informed and engaged. However, there's a small proportion that are still at risk of either inadvertent exposure through failure to appropriately recognise materials or situations where asbestos need to be considered, or because they disagree that small amounts of exposure to asbestos can be very dangerous. So again, there's a clear need for ongoing education of tradespeople on this issue, especially new apprentices. And there were some clear differences emerging by age where we looked at this group in terms of knowledge and awareness of asbestos and its risks. There's a strong desire for additional formal training and further practical information that can assist in terms of identifying materials or situations where asbestos may be present. For DIY home renovators, this group straddles basically the general public and the trades groups. They're more likely to be engaged in behaviours that potentially expose them to asbestos, but unlikely to have attended any formal training on asbestos, in how to identify it, how to safely remove and dispose of it during any DIY activities. As such, we recommended to the agency that this be a key audience for ongoing communication. And finally, real estate agents and landlords, potentially key influencers in terms of behaviours in this broader community. Less than 1 in 5 have received formal training, but there's a strong desire for more training. And we want to make sure that these guys, if they're an information provider, that they're doing it from a clear evidence-based, as opposed to potentially misleading information, albeit in good faith. Thank you.